Dakota Territory, 1880. While every homesteader raced to throw up a single-wall cabin before winter, Norwegian immigrant Lars Nygaard was still building in late September. Wind cut across the prairie at 40 miles per hour, rattling barn siding and driving snow through every crack in the valley. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He built a 24 by 32-foot pole barn shell around his tiny 14 by 18-foot cabin, leaving a 4-foot walkway on every side filled with nothing but still air. He spent 2 months on what others finished in 3 weeks, creating what they mocked as a house inside a house. Then January 1881 arrived. The hard winter locked Dakota Territory in ice for 7 straight months. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero, with winds that made it feel like 40 below. Standard cabins failed. Families burned through 12 cords of wood and still fought indoor frost on their walls. But inside that fool's double house? The inner cabin stayed a steady 60 degrees while neighbors shivered at 20 degrees, a 40-degree difference using the same small stove and less fuel. What did he understand about wind, thermal protection, and survival that frontier wisdom completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. January 1881. Dawn breaks over a Dakota homestead, locked in the grip of a blizzard that has raged for 3 days without mercy. Wind howls across the prairie at 45 miles per hour, driving snow so thick that fence posts disappear 20 yards from the nearest window. Outside, the mercury sits at 10 degrees below zero, but the wind makes exposed skin feel the bite of 40 below within seconds. Inside Hans Petersen's 14 by 16-foot cabin, built according to every piece of conventional frontier wisdom he could gather, the morning temperature barely reaches 20 degrees. Ice crystals coat the inside of his north wall despite a cast iron stove that has devoured nearly 4 cubic feet of split cottonwood since midnight. His wife huddles under 3 quilts while their children sleep pressed against each other for warmth, their breath visible in the gray morning light. The stove roars constantly, yet frost still forms on nail heads driven into the wall planks, and a cup of water left on the far table develops a skin of ice whenever the fire dies to coals. 200 yards away, inside what neighbors had mocked as the fool's barn, a different scene unfolds. The outer shell of Lars Nygaard's pole barn takes the full assault of the prairie wind, its rough-sawn vertical boards chattering and flexing, but the structure holds firm. Snow drives through gaps between the battens and piles in small drifts along the interior walls of the 24 by 32-foot shell, yet the air inside this outer envelope reads 15 degrees warmer than the howling darkness beyond its walls. Within this protected space, separated by 4 feet of still air on every side, sits Lars's original 14 by 18-foot cabin. Here, a simple thermometer mounted on the wall away from the heating stove reads 58 degrees. The same size stove that powers the Petersen cabin burns at a gentle idle, its damper partially closed, consuming perhaps half the wood that roars through Hans's firebox every hour. Lars's children sleep comfortably under single blankets, and no trace of frost mars the interior walls that remain a steady 40 degrees warmer than his neighbor's desperate efforts can achieve. This dramatic difference represents the payoff of a design that every neighbor had ridiculed the previous summer, when Lars spent August and September erecting what appeared to be a massive barn around a perfectly good house. The mathematics are simple but devastating to conventional frontier logic. Same stove, same fuel source, same outdoor conditions, yet a 40-degree advantage in living comfort achieved through what frontier settlers dismissed as wasteful overbuilding. The story begins 18 months earlier when Lars first arrived in Aurora County to file his homestead claim under the Act of 1862. Like thousands of Norwegian immigrants drawn by railroad advertisements promising fertile soil and opportunity, he selected his 160 acres near the newly laid tracks, close enough to haul supplies from the depot, but far enough from town to claim the best remaining timber along the seasonal creek. His first winter taught him lessons no agricultural bulletin had prepared him for. Following standard frontier practice, he had thrown up a conventional single-room cabin that autumn, using cottonwood logs chinked with prairie clay and heated by a standard cast-iron stove. The structure measured 14 by 16 feet with a low ceiling, one small window, and walls built exactly as his neighbors constructed theirs. Through November and December, he burned nearly 2 cords of split wood per month, yet the cabin remained barely tolerable on calm days and miserably cold whenever the prairie wind rose above 15 miles per hour. The problem revealed itself most clearly during storms, when wind-driven cold seemed to penetrate every crack and joint despite careful chinking. On calm days at the same outdoor temperature, the cabin felt comfortable at 55 degrees. When winter gales swept across the grassland, that same cabin became nearly uninhabitable unless he doubled his wood consumption and kept the stove roaring around the clock. The wind was stealing his heat faster than the fire could replace it, turning every board joint and window frame into a pathway for Arctic air. 2 encounters during that first winter planted the seeds of his revolutionary solution. Trading with a Hidatsa family whose earth lodge sat near the river bottom, Lars observed how their dome-shaped, earth-banked home maintained steady interior temperatures even during the worst storms. Smoke rose lazily from the central opening, while wind screamed overhead, unable to penetrate the massive thermal buffer of sod and timber that surrounded the living space. The lodge stayed near 60 degrees with minimal fuel, protected by 3 feet of earth that absorbed the wind's assault and stored the day's heat for the long night hours. Equally important were memories of his Uncle Ole's farm in coastal Norway, where house and barn shared a continuous roof and thick stone walls. The livestock occupied one end of the building while the family lived in the other, separated by the haymow and grain storage that formed a natural buffer zone. Animal heat warmed the floor, thick walls blocked the North Sea gales, and the barn took the brunt of every storm while the house remained snug and dry behind its protective shell. By spring of 1880, Lars had sketched his solution, an American adaptation of both the earth lodge principle and the Norwegian house barn, using readily available lumber instead of stone or sod. He would build a simple pole barn around his existing cabin, creating a wide band of still air that would serve as insulation while the outer shell absorbed the punishment that prairie winds delivered to exposed buildings. When he explained his plan at the spring gathering, neighbors responded with the mixture of skepticism and mockery that greets most departures from established practice. Hans Petersen, who served as the area's informal authority on building matters due to his blacksmithing skills and subscription to farm journals, quoted directly from an 1855 edition of New England Farmer, insisting that 10 cords of wood will suffice for any man who has tight rooms and good stoves. Better chinking and more careful construction were all Lars needed, Hans argued. Building a second structure around the first represented wasteful duplication of effort and materials. Other neighbors offered similar conventional wisdom. Why not simply add another layer of boards to the existing walls? Why not bank higher with straw and manure? Why not invest in a larger stove rather than a larger building? The consensus held that Lars was solving the wrong problem with the wrong solution, choosing expensive complexity over proven frontier methods. Yet Lars had run the numbers through his first brutal winter and understood what his neighbors had not yet experienced. The enemy was not simply cold air, but moving air that stripped heat from every surface and found every weakness in construction designed for gentler climates. A single wall, no matter how carefully built, remained vulnerable to the prairie wind's relentless assault. What he needed was not a better wall, but a wind shadow large enough to contain his entire house, creating the calm air zone that would let his cabin hold its heat instead of losing it to every gust that swept across 200 miles of open grassland. Summer 1880 brought an unusually long Indian summer to Dakota Territory, extending the building season well into September and giving Lars the time he needed to execute his unconventional plan. While his neighbors focused on cutting firewood and banking their existing cabins with the traditional 18 to 24 inches of straw and manure around the foundations, Lars began the methodical construction of what would become the most talked about structure in Aurora County. The foundation work began with 12 holes, each augured 3 feet into the prairie soil and spaced 8 feet apart in a precise 30 by 38-foot rectangle. Into these holes went rough-hewn posts, either split from local cottonwood or cut as 6 by 6 uprights, each measuring 8 to 10 inches in diameter. The posts rose 14 feet above ground level, creating the framework for a simple gable roof with a 412 pitch that would shed snow efficiently while providing generous overhangs to protect the walkway space between outer shell and inner cabin. Hans Petersen watched this early construction with the confident skepticism of a man who had read the agricultural journals and understood accepted building practice. He had spent his summer cutting an additional 12 cords of split wood, confident that superior fuel preparation would prove more effective than Lars's elaborate carpentry project. His cabin walls remained the standard single thickness of 1-inch boards, carefully chinked and sealed according to the methods recommended in every frontier building guide he had encountered. The technical reasoning behind Lars's approach would have been familiar to any Norwegian farmer or Native American lodge builder, though it contradicted everything the agricultural press recommended for prairie construction. Air itself, when trapped in a still cavity, provided measurable insulation value. Even a simple 1-inch air gap could add noticeable thermal resistance to a wall assembly. Lars was creating an air gap measuring 4 to 6 feet in width, filled with air that would remain nearly motionless due to the protection provided by the outer shell. More critically, he understood the relationship between wind and heat loss that conventional frontier building ignored. When prairie gales struck a thin wall directly, they created convective currents that stripped warm air from the interior surface while forcing cold air through every crack and joint in the construction. Wind chill affected buildings just as severely as it affected human skin, dramatically increasing the rate at which heated interior air lost its thermal energy to the outdoor environment. By surrounding his tight inner cabin with a loose outer shell, Lars created what building scientists would later recognize as a double envelope system. The outer barrier took the full assault of wind and weather while maintaining only minimal thermal resistance. The inner cabin, now protected from direct wind contact, could retain heat with far greater efficiency. The airspace between the two shells would moderate temperature swings and provide additional thermal mass, creating a buffer zone that remained significantly warmer than outdoor conditions, even without direct heating. The construction details reflected careful planning rather than hasty frontier improvisation. The outer shell used vertical board and batten siding, with 1-inch rough boards sealed by 1x3 battens that covered the joints. Lars deliberately left this construction somewhat loose, allowing for thermal expansion and contraction while maintaining basic weather protection. The roof extended 2 to 3 feet beyond the walls on all sides, creating deep overhangs that would prevent driving snow from reaching the walkway space during the winter storms. Inside this protective envelope, his original cabin sat slightly off-center, positioned to create a 5-foot wide service area along the north wall where he could stack firewood under cover. The remaining sides maintained 3 to 4 feet of circulation space, wide enough for comfortable movement while narrow enough to prevent unwanted air circulation that might compromise the thermal buffer effect. Neighbors continued their traditional preparation methods, while Lars worked through August and September. The Sorensen family added extra quilts to their windows and spent considerable effort improving the chinking between their log walls. The Jensens invested in a larger cast iron stove, reasoning that more heating capacity would solve any comfort problems the winter might bring. Each family cut between 10 and 15 cords of firewood, following the established wisdom that abundant fuel represented the most reliable hedge against cold weather. The social pressure remained constant throughout the construction period. At the weekly gathering at the church schoolhouse, conversations inevitably turned to Lars's unusual project. One neighbor joked that he would need a compass to find his own front door, while another offered to paint directional arrows on the barn walls to help visitors navigate the complex. The underlying criticism remained consistent. Lars was solving a simple problem with an unnecessarily complicated solution. Hans Petersen served as the most vocal critic, repeatedly citing his agricultural journals and practical experience. A properly built cabin with tight walls and adequate fuel should provide comfortable shelter for any reasonable winter, he argued. The problem with Lars's first cabin had been insufficient attention to detail in the initial construction, not any fundamental flaw in single-wall building methods. Extra lumber would be better invested in improved wall thickness or a more substantial foundation rather than an entirely separate structure. The technical specifications of Lars's outer shell revealed the thoroughness of his approach. The north wall, which would face the prevailing winter winds, received minimal window openings and maximum structural bracing. The south and east walls included several small windows that would admit winter sunlight into the buffer zone, potentially adding modest solar heating to the airspace during clear days. The main entrance featured a small vestibule that created an airlock effect, preventing direct wind penetration to the inner cabin door whenever someone entered or left the building. Along the interior north wall of the outer shell, Lars constructed a systematic firewood storage system. Stacked 3 to 4 cords of split wood under the protective roof, this arrangement served multiple purposes beyond simple convenience. The wood remained dry and accessible regardless of outdoor weather conditions. More importantly, the thermal mass of the stacked cordwood would absorb heat that leaked from the inner cabin during the day and release it slowly during the night, helping to moderate temperature swings in the buffer zone. By early October, when the first significant snowfall typically arrived in Dakota Territory, Lars's double shell system stood complete and ready for testing. His neighbors had completed their own winter preparations according to established frontier practice: banked foundations, sealed window frames, and substantial fuel supplies cut and split according to the recommendations of agricultural authorities who had never experienced a prairie winter. The contrast in approaches could not have been more stark. Conventional wisdom focused on improving the performance of single-wall construction through better materials, more careful craftsmanship, and abundant fuel supplies. Lars had chosen instead to abandon single-wall construction entirely, creating a fundamentally different approach that used an unheated outer shell to moderate the environmental conditions that his inner cabin would need to resist. As October 15 arrived with the first serious blizzard of what would become known as the hard winter, both approaches would face their first real test under conditions that would push frontier building methods to their absolute limits. The first test came October 15, 1880, when a 3-day blizzard roared across Dakota Territory with the fury that would mark the beginning of the hard winter. Snow fell 3 feet deep in a single day, while temperatures plummeted to 0 degrees with winds that made the air feel like 20 below. Railroad service stopped immediately as drifts buried the tracks, and families across the territory found themselves isolated with whatever fuel and supplies they had managed to stockpile during the brief autumn. Hans Petersen's cabin, built according to every piece of conventional wisdom he could gather, struggled against the storm's assault. Despite banking 18 inches high with straw and manure, despite careful chinking between every board, despite a roaring cast-iron stove that consumed 4 cubic feet of split wood every few hours, his main room barely maintained 30 degrees during the storm's peak. Ice formed on the heads of nails driven into the north wall, and water buckets left overnight developed thick skins of ice despite sitting only 8 feet from the constantly tended fire. The Jensen family faced similar conditions in their single-wall plank cabin. Their children slept fully dressed under multiple layers of quilts, while their parents took turns feeding the stove throughout the night. Even with aggressive firing that sent sparks up the chimney in a continuous stream, the far corners of their 14 by 16 foot room dropped below freezing whenever the wind gusted above 30 miles per hour. Inside Lars's double shell system, the storm revealed the dramatic effectiveness of his unconventional approach. 3 thermometers told the story with mathematical precision. Outside the barn, temperatures held steady at 0 degrees with fierce wind. Inside the outer shell, in the protected walkway space, the mercury rose to 25 degrees despite the complete absence of any heating. The wind had been stopped dead by the outer walls, and the 4-foot air gap was already moderating the temperature swing by 25 degrees without any energy input beyond what leaked from the inner cabin. Within the inner cabin itself, conditions remained remarkably stable. A thermometer mounted on the wall opposite the heating stove read 58 degrees, maintained by a fire that idled at half the intensity Hans required to achieve 30 degrees in his conventional structure. The same size stove, burning the same cottonwood fuel, yet producing nearly 30 degrees of additional warmth while consuming roughly half the wood per hour. As the storm raged through its third day, the fuel mathematics began to favor Lars's approach dramatically. Hans burned through nearly a full cord of split wood, maintaining marginal comfort, while Lars consumed perhaps half that amount to achieve genuinely comfortable living conditions. More tellingly, the Jensen family reported that their stove required constant attention, demanding fresh fuel every 2 hours during the worst wind, while Lars could load his firebox and expect steady heat for 4 to 5 hours between feedings. The winter locked in with unprecedented severity as November brought storm after storm across the northern plains. Historical records would later document 11 feet of accumulated snow in some communities, with temperatures hovering below zero for weeks at a time. Railroad service remained disrupted for months as drifts buried entire train cars, cutting off the coal shipments that many families had counted on to supplement their wood supplies. By mid-January, the fuel crisis had become acute for conventionally built homesteads. The Petersons had burned through 8 of their 12 cords, putting them on track to exhaust their wood supply before the winter ended. At their current consumption rate of nearly 2 cords per month during the severest weather, they faced the possibility of running out of fuel with potentially 2 months of winter remaining. The Jensens confronted similar arithmetic. Starting with 10 cords in October, they had consumed 6 by the new year, leaving them with perhaps 6 weeks of fuel if the weather continued at its current severity. Their larger stove, purchased specifically to provide more heating capacity, was proving to be a liability as it demanded more fuel to maintain the same interior temperatures that smaller stoves achieved in better insulated structures. Lars maintained careful records of his own fuel consumption throughout the winter, creating a detailed log that would vindicate his approach with undeniable numbers. Through the worst months of December and January, his system used approximately 1¼ cords per month, roughly 60% of what his neighbors required for inferior comfort levels. His inner cabin remained consistently above 55 degrees, while conventional cabins struggled to maintain 40 degrees during storms. The thermal performance gap became most apparent during high wind events, when conventional structures lost heat faster than their stoves could replace it. During a particularly severe storm in late January, when sustained winds reached 50 miles per hour with gusts above 60, Hans's cabin interior dropped to 25 degrees despite continuous firing, while Lars's inner room held steady at 57 degrees with his stove dampered down to prevent overheating. Neighbors began making informal visits to Lars's barn during the worst weather, ostensibly to borrow tools or discuss spring planting, but actually to experience the dramatic temperature difference his system provided. Stepping from the brutal outdoor conditions into the barn's protected walkway provided immediate relief from wind chill, while entering the inner cabin felt like stepping into a different season entirely. The social dynamics began shifting as the mathematical advantages became undeniable. Hans, who had been the most vocal critic of Lars's wasteful construction, found himself asking detailed questions about post placement, roof design, and air gap dimensions. The Sorensens quietly began planning modifications to their own homestead, sketching shed roof additions that would create partial buffer zones around their existing structure. Most tellingly, several families began consolidating their fuel supplies, burning only enough wood in their own cabins to prevent pipe freezing while spending their evenings in Lars's comfortably heated inner room. This informal fuel sharing arrangement allowed them to stretch their remaining cordwood through the deepest part of winter while highlighting the efficiency advantages that proper thermal design could provide. The Vindication extended beyond simple comfort measurements. Tools stored in the barn's buffer zone remained rust-free and workable throughout the winter, while similar tools in unheated outbuildings became brittle and difficult to use. Ice blocks stored in the protected walkway melted more slowly than those kept outside, demonstrating that the thermal moderation effect worked in both directions. Even the livestock benefited, as animals sheltered in lean-tos attached to the barn's south wall showed better condition than those housed in conventional sheds. By February, as the winter entered its 5th month without meaningful relief, the fuel arithmetic had settled the argument conclusively. Conventional cabins required 12 to 15 cords of wood to maintain marginal heating through the season, while Lars's double shell system would complete the winter having consumed perhaps 7 cords total. The 30 to 40% fuel savings achieved through superior thermal design had become the difference between comfort and crisis for multiple families who found refuge in his revolutionary approach to frontier building. Spring 1881 arrived 6 weeks late across Dakota Territory, but when the March thaws finally began, they revealed the full scope of what the hard winter had accomplished. The mathematical vindication of Lars's double-shell design had become undeniable through 7 months of the most severe testing conditions frontier building methods had ever faced. His fuel consumption logs, maintained with Norwegian precision throughout the winter, told the story in numbers that even the most stubborn adherent to conventional wisdom could not dispute. Lars had burned 8½ cords of split cottonwood to heat his inner cabin and accommodate the refugee families who sheltered there during the worst storms. His neighbors, heating smaller spaces with identical stoves and similar fuel sources, had consumed between 12 and 16 cords each, with several families running completely out of wood during February and March. The fuel savings exceeded 30% even during the most severe weather conditions, while providing interior temperatures that averaged 20 to 30 degrees warmer than conventional single-wall construction achieved. Hans Petersen completed his personal conversion from skeptic to advocate during the final weeks of winter, when his own cabin became uninhabitable during a late March blizzard that brought temperatures back down to 20 below zero. Spending 4 consecutive nights in Lars's inner cabin while his own structure froze solid, Hans experienced the thermal performance difference that no amount of theoretical discussion could have conveyed. His agricultural journals had proven inadequate guides for building in conditions that exceeded the experience of their Eastern authors. The Jensen family faced even more dramatic vindication of Lars's approach. Having exhausted their cordwood supply by early March, they would have faced catastrophic fuel shortages without access to his efficiently heated refuge. Their children slept warm and comfortable in the inner cabin, while their own home registered interior temperatures below freezing for weeks at a time. The larger stove they had purchased specifically to provide superior heating capacity had become a liability, demanding more fuel than their supplies could sustain while delivering inferior performance to Lars's smaller, more efficient system. As word of the thermal performance spread through the isolated community, other homesteaders began planning modifications to their own structures. The Sorensen family spent April sketching plans for a continuous shed roof around 3 sides of their existing cabin, creating unheated storage space that would serve as a partial buffer zone during the next winter's storms. Their design represented a compromise between conventional single-wall construction and Lars's complete double-shell approach, but even partial implementation of his principles promised substantial improvements in fuel efficiency and interior comfort. Eric Sorensen had measured the temperature differences in his own cabin during the worst storms, noting that rooms on the windward side registered 5 to 8 degrees colder than those protected by other parts of the structure. His planned addition would create a sacrificial outer layer along the north and west walls, taking the brunt of wind-driven cold while allowing the original cabin walls to maintain heat more effectively. The mathematics suggested potential fuel savings of 15 to 20%, enough to justify the construction costs, even if the improvements proved only partially effective. Other neighbors pursued different applications of Lars's core principles. The Anderson family planted 4 rows of fast-growing cottonwood saplings along the north and west sides of their homestead, creating the foundation for a living windbreak that would mature over the following decade. Agricultural extension bulletins from the land-grant colleges were beginning to document wind reduction effects from properly designed tree shelters, reporting heating fuel savings of 10 to 25% for farmsteads protected by mature windbreaks. The technical principles underlying Lars's success began spreading through informal knowledge networks as neighbors shared observations and measurements from the hard winter. The relationship between wind speed and heat loss became viscerally understood by families who had watched their interior temperatures fluctuate with every gust. The insulation value of still air became apparent to anyone who had experienced the temperature difference between Lars's barn walkway and the exposed prairie beyond. More sophisticated adoptions of the double shell concept appeared throughout the region over the following years. Germany Feuerwands. Immigrants arriving in 1882 brought house barn designs similar to those Lars remembered from Norway, creating continuous structures where livestock and human habitation shared the protection of substantial outer walls and common roof systems. These traditional European building forms, adapted to prairie conditions, achieved thermal efficiency comparable to Lars's innovative approach while serving multiple functions for mixed farming operations. The validation extended beyond fuel savings and interior comfort to include structural durability and weather protection. Lars's outer shell had sacrificed its cosmetic appearance to protect the inner cabin from wind-driven ice, hail, and thermal cycling that damaged single-wall structures throughout the region. Paint and siding on the inner cabin remained in excellent condition after the brutal winter, while conventional buildings showed substantial weathering from direct exposure to the elements. Tool storage and equipment protection provided additional practical advantages that neighbors had not anticipated during their initial skepticism. Metal implements stored in the barn's buffer zone remained rust-free and workable throughout the winter, while similar tools in unheated outbuildings required extensive maintenance and repair after months of freeze-thaw cycling. Harness leather and wooden tool handles preserved better in the moderated environment, reducing replacement costs and maintenance labor that conventional storage methods imposed. By 1885, variations of Lars's approach had become common throughout Aurora County and the surrounding region. New homesteaders arriving from Norway and Germany brought traditional building knowledge that incorporated similar principles, while established families modified existing structures to capture some of the thermal advantages his double-shell design provided. The Fool's Barn had evolved into accepted best practice for serious frontier builders who prioritized fuel efficiency and interior comfort over initial construction simplicity. The technical understanding that supported these adoptions reflected the accumulation of practical experience rather than formal engineering education. Families had learned through direct measurement that wind dramatically increased heating fuel requirements, that still air provided meaningful insulation value, and that sacrificial outer shells could protect primary structures from weather damage while creating thermally moderated buffer zones. These principles, derived from Old World building traditions and Native American construction methods, had proven superior to the simplified approaches recommended in agricultural journals written for milder climates. Thomas Nygaard, Lars's grandson, would later recall that visitors to the homestead during the early 1900s consistently remarked on the comfortable interior conditions achieved with remarkably modest fuel consumption. The inner cabin, by then replaced with a larger frame house but still surrounded by the protective barn shell on the north and west sides, regularly maintained interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than neighboring structures during winter storms. The overbuilt wind protection that neighbors had mocked in 1880 had become the foundation for a family homestead that remained comfortable and efficient through decades of prairie winters. The legacy extended beyond individual structures to influence regional building practices and agricultural extension recommendations. Land-grant college publications began incorporating windbreak design and thermal buffering concepts into their guidance for prairie construction, acknowledging that frontier conditions required approaches different from those developed in forested regions with milder climates. The practical knowledge that Lars had synthesized from Norwegian tradition, Native American building methods, and direct experience with prairie weather became incorporated into formal educational curricula for homesteaders and agricultural settlers. When the final accounting was complete, the hard winter of 1880 to 1881 had validated not just Lars's specific design, but the broader principle that overbuilding for extreme conditions provided better long-term value than conventional approaches optimized for average weather. His house inside a house had survived the worst environmental testing the Great Plains could deliver while using less fuel and providing superior comfort to simpler construction methods that frontier wisdom had endorsed. Spring 1881 arrived 6 weeks late across Dakota Territory, revealing the complete vindication of Lars's double-shell design through the most comprehensive real-world test frontier building methods had ever endured. The fuel consumption records he had maintained with Norwegian precision throughout 7 months of brutal winter told an irrefutable story. His system had burned 8 1/2 cords of split cottonwood while heating his inner cabin and sheltering multiple refugee families during the worst storms. His neighbors, using identical stoves to heat smaller single-wall cabins, had consumed between 12 and 16 cords each, with several families completely exhausting their wood supplies before the season ended. The mathematical advantage exceeded 30% fuel savings while delivering interior temperatures that consistently ran 20 to 30 degrees warmer than conventional construction achieved under identical outdoor conditions. Hans Petersen, who had quoted agricultural journals and dismissed the project as wasteful duplication, found himself asking detailed technical questions about post spacing, air gap dimensions, and thermal buffer principles. The blacksmith who had served as the area's building authority now sought to understand why his carefully chinked single walls had proven inadequate for conditions that exceeded the experience of Eastern agricultural writers. The Jensen family faced even more dramatic proof of superior design. Having exhausted their cordwood supply by early March, they had survived the final weeks of winter entirely through access to Lars's efficiently heated refuge. Their children had slept warm and comfortable in the inner cabin, while their own home registered interior temperatures below freezing for days at a time. The larger cast iron stove they had purchased specifically to provide superior heating capacity had become a liability, consuming fuel faster than their supplies could sustain while delivering performance inferior to Lars's smaller system, operating within its protective thermal envelope. Word of the performance advantages spread throughout the region as isolated homesteaders emerged from winter and began comparing experiences. Eric Sorensen had documented temperature differences within his own cabin during storms, measuring 5 to 8 degree variations between windward and protected walls. He immediately began planning a continuous shed roof addition around 3 sides of his existing structure, creating unheated storage space that would function as a partial buffer zone. Even incomplete implementation of Lars's principles promised fuel savings of 15 to 20%, enough to justify construction costs while improving interior comfort significantly. Other neighbors pursued different applications of the core thermal concepts. The Anderson family planted 4 rows of cottonwood saplings along their homestead's north and west perimeters, establishing a living windbreak that would mature into substantial wind protection over the following decade. Agricultural extension bulletins from land-grant colleges were beginning to document fuel savings of 10 to 25% for farmsteads protected by properly designed tree shelters, validating the broader principle that wind control translated directly into heating efficiency. The technical understanding spread through informal networks as families shared observations and measurements from the hard winter. The relationship between wind speed and interior temperatures became viscerally apparent to anyone who had watched their cabin thermometers fluctuate with every gust. The insulation value of still air gained practical meaning for neighbors who had experienced the dramatic temperature difference between Lars's protected walkway and the brutal conditions beyond his barn walls. German immigrants arriving in 1882 brought house barn designs that incorporated similar principles within traditional European building forms. These structures, where livestock and human habitation shared substantial outer walls and common roofing systems, achieved thermal efficiency comparable to Lars's innovative approach, while serving multiple functions for diversified farming operations. The convergence of Old World building wisdom with New World frontier innovation created hybrid designs that optimized both fuel efficiency and agricultural productivity. Validation extended beyond heating performance to include structural durability and weather protection advantages that had not been anticipated during the initial skepticism. Lars's outer shell had absorbed wind-driven ice, hail damage, and thermal cycling that left conventional buildings throughout the region showing substantial weathering and structural stress. Paint and siding on his protected inner cabin remained in excellent condition after the brutal winter, while single-wall structures required extensive maintenance and repair from direct exposure to the elements. Equipment protection provided additional practical benefits that enhanced the system's overall value. Metal tools stored in the barn's buffer zone remained rust-free and functional throughout the winter, while similar implements in unheated outbuildings required extensive rehabilitation after months of freeze-thaw cycling. Harness leather, wooden handles, and other organic materials preserved better in the moderated environment, reducing replacement costs and maintenance labor that conventional storage methods imposed on frontier operations. By 1885, variations of the double shell approach had become standard practice among serious builders throughout Aurora County. New Norwegian and German settlers brought traditional knowledge that incorporated thermal buffering principles, while established families modified existing structures to capture heating advantages the hard winter had demonstrated conclusively. The Fool's Barn had evolved into accepted best practice for homesteaders who prioritized long-term efficiency and comfort over initial construction simplicity. The accumulated practical knowledge reflected direct experience rather than formal engineering education. Families had learned through measurement and observation that wind dramatically increased heating fuel requirements, that still air provided meaningful thermal resistance, and that sacrificial outer shells could protect primary structures while creating moderated buffer environments. These principles, synthesized from Norwegian house barn traditions, Native American earth lodge concepts, and harsh frontier testing, had proven superior to simplified approaches recommended in agricultural publications written for milder eastern climates. Thomas Nygaard would later document how the homestead continued delivering superior performance through subsequent decades. Visitors during the early 1900s consistently remarked on comfortable interior conditions achieved with modest fuel consumption. The inner house, eventually replaced with a larger frame structure but still surrounded by protective shell walls on exposed sides, regularly maintained temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than neighboring buildings during winter storms. The overbuilt wind protection that had prompted mockery in 1880 provided the foundation for efficient, comfortable heating through generations of prairie winters. The influence reached beyond individual structures to affect regional building standards and agricultural extension guidance. Land-grant college publications began incorporating windbreak design and thermal buffering concepts into official recommendations for prairie construction, acknowledging that frontier conditions required approaches different from those developed in forested regions with moderate climates. Educational curricula for agricultural settlers incorporated practical knowledge that Lars had derived from traditional sources and validated through extreme weather testing. Modern building science would eventually provide theoretical explanations for the performance advantages that frontier builders had discovered through trial and necessity. Double-envelope houses developed during the 1970s employed identical principles of wind protection and thermal buffering that Lars had implemented nearly a century earlier. Passive solar design concepts acknowledged the same relationship between air gaps, thermal mass, and heating efficiency that his Norwegian intuition and Native American observations had suggested. Contemporary studies of convective heat loss and infiltration rates confirmed the mathematical relationships between wind exposure and fuel consumption that prairie homesteaders had learned through bitter experience. The final vindication came through simple longevity measurements that transcended theoretical discussions. Structures built according to Lars's enhanced thermal principles continued providing efficient, comfortable shelter through decades of prairie weather, while conventional single-wall cabins required constant maintenance, modification, or replacement to remain habitable. The house inside a house had proven that thoughtful overbuilding for extreme conditions delivered superior long-term value compared to simplified approaches optimized for average weather patterns that frontier reality rarely provided.